What do we mean by dialectics? How does the dialectic work? And this is perhaps the most important point, why does it matter? Some activists have never heard of the term. Some have, but have avoided it because the concept sounds abstract and difficult. There's always a danger that individuals on the left will use what seem like inaccessible jargon to make themselves look clever at others' expense. Yet dialectics at its heart, a simple proposition. And what's more, it's key to grappling with how we can change the world. Dialectics takes as its starting point that the social world is in a constant state of change and flux, primarily because of contradictions. Put simply, the clash between opposing forces. So this episode will outline some of the key elements of the development of dialectical thinking and the main terms involved. Most importantly, I'll use the dialectical method to unbundle two of the questions that are most likely to trip up left activists. You're listening to The Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity. We're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia, and if you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glanz, and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Naarm or Melbourne. Looking at the impact of the second Trump presidency, the potential changes that flow from the widespread use of AI and the way in which global warming is damaging the climate, the idea of a world in change and flux seems pretty self-evident. But for many centuries, European philosophy took as its starting point that everything was fixed in place, that people were born into their station in life, and that the rule of kings was ordained by God. This reflected the very slow pace of economic development within feudalism, a society in which the mass of the population lived and laboured on the land and would rarely travel beyond the closest market town. These ideas were popularised by the dominant social media influencers of the epoch, the Catholic Church, which just happened to be a major feudal landowner. The Church drew on the ideas of the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who had argued that everything had a purpose and that change was abnormal. Aristotle had argued that motion, change, was something that happened when bodies were disturbed, shaken out of their natural places. Given the chance, those bodies would move back to their natural places to be at rest. Now, of course, these ideas suited the kings, aristocrats, and the church, who benefited from the feudal status quo and who got fat while the peasants suffered. But this cosy setup was disturbed by two factors: the huge steps taken forward by scientists in the 17th century, and the development of a capitalist class whose members made their money not from land, but from control of money, of capital. The scientists challenged the idea that the world was created by God with the earth at its centre. They turned the ideas of Aristotle on their head. Now it appeared that the earth went around the sun and that motion rather than inertia was the norm. The emerging capitalists also challenged the status quo. They chafed at laws and customs that privileged landowners and put obstacles in the way of commerce. This is the period known as the Enlightenment. This shift away from religious obscurantism to an attempt to understand the world rationally had its political impacts too. The idea that society needed to change to serve people had dramatic implications, but there were limitations. Enlightenment thought took human nature as unchanging. It saw progress simply as a battle of ideas, especially against the stranglehold of religion. And because its proponents saw change coming through education at a time when the vast majority were still illiterate, they drew elitist conclusions. The French philosopher Voltaire wrote to a colleague, and I quote, "What does it matter that our tailor and cobbler are governed by the priests? The point is that those with whom you live are forced to lower their eyes before the philosopher. It is in the interest of the king, that is, of the state, that the philosophers run society. But it wasn't long before kings became something of an imperiled species. The French Revolution of 1789 saw the eruption onto the streets of those tailors and cobblers, and the eventual beheading of the king. Now the artisans who did the fighting let power slip through their fingers to the emergent bourgeoisie, the new emerging capitalist class, but the revolutionary impact of their actions was still enormous. One philosopher who was inspired by the revolution was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who was born in 1770 in what is today Germany. Even as he rose to high rank, becoming the chair of philosophy at the University of Berlin, he celebrated the French Revolution every year. Hegel invested much of his professional life in developing the idea of the dialectic. In doing so, he tried to show that history was not a series of accidents but had a logic running through it. First, he argued that we needed to see the world as a totality rather than deal with each phenomenon separately from each other. So, for example, the increase in the number and reach of pandemics this century cannot be understood only by studying viruses. We also have to see the context of capitalist expansion into tropical rainforests by creating roads, opening mines, and the hunting and eating of wild animals, thereby exposing humans to diseases that previously had been contained locally. Within this totality, Hegel insisted that contradictions drove change. He wrote in his book, The Science of Logic, quote, "Contradiction is at the root of all movement in life, and it is only insofar as it contains a contradiction that anything moves and has impulse and activity." He saw that change coming in 3 steps. First, there is simple unity, when we see the object itself before any change takes place. But even at this point, the object has the potential to develop. Second, there's the negation, when we see the object give rise to its opposite. And third comes the negation of the negation, when we see these opposites reconciled into a greater unity. Now, these 3 steps can also be expressed as thesis, what is, antithesis, what is opposing it, and synthesis, the new state of being that comes out of that contradiction. A proposition, a disagreement with that proposition, leading to a higher level of understanding. Now, a common example is the acorn, which exists as an object, but within itself it contains a contradiction, the potential to become a tree. Taken together with rain and sunshine, the acorn is negated. It starts to change. And as a result of this contradiction, it grows into an oak tree, which is the negation of the negation. Now, it can be said that such an example has a circular logic. Acorn and tree, and then yet more acorns. But applying the same method to society offers much more profound results. So the working class exists. It comes into contradiction with capital, the negation, and through that struggle it may emerge as the negation of the negation, a greater unity. In other words, the defeat of capitalism and its replacement with socialism. As British Marxist Alice Kalinikos notes, this approach has distinct revolutionary implications. As he writes of Hegel's contribution, and I quote, "This meant that capitalism could not be the end of history, but merely one stage, and that it contained within itself its own contradiction." Hegel made another important contribution, noting what he called the transformation of quantity into quality. By this he meant the way a succession of small changes, each of which leaves the basic character of a thing unaltered, can lead, beyond a certain point, to its complete transformation. For example, gradually reducing the temperature of water makes no significant difference, until it reaches 0 or sub-0 degrees when it changes from a liquid to a solid. This too has revolutionary implications. Translated into class struggle, it can help understand the way the working class learns through partial struggles, developing an anti-capitalist consciousness that can, at a critical point, burst through into a desire to bring down the system. Now, it's important, of course, to note that these are abstract models of change. In the real world, nothing is determined. If there's a drought, the acorn may turn into a desiccated husk. If workers do not organise for the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, the contradictions may express themselves in episodic fights over wages, leaving the system intact. Now, Hegel was dealing with these questions at the philosophical level. Karl Marx took his insights and combined with them a materialist view of history. Where Hegel saw the outcome of contradiction as a human society rising to what he called the absolute spirit, sometimes understood as God, Marx argued that the contradiction between the working class and the capitalists could lead to a new society of freedom. And where Hegel saw the contradiction as being driven by ideas, Marx argued that the contradictions were real and immediate, above all in the exploitation of wage labour. Marx brought together dialectics and materialism to understand the world as a totality, but as a totality driven by inherent change, conflict and contradictions rooted in the material world. And he argued that humans could consciously act to change the world they found themselves in. Writing in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, he said, and again I quote, "Men, meaning people, make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but as circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. We are not acorns. Our activity, including the ideas generated by humans about the world, can also react back on and in turn transform the material underpinnings of society." So how can we understand and summarise the dialectic? The British Marxist Ian Birchall put it this way, and once again I quote, "Dialectics is not a set of laws independent of human will. It is simply a means of describing how human beings make their own history." So what does this have to do with day-to-day activity for socialists and other activists? Writing in 1939, the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky argued, "Dialectical training of the mind, as necessary to a revolutionary fighter as finger exercises to a pianist, demands approaching all problems as processes and not as motionless categories." In that spirit, I want to turn to two questions that bedevil the modern radical left. How to relate to social democracy, principally in the form of the Labour Party, and how to relate to the trade union bureaucracy. Let's take the Labour Party first. The ALP is a capitalist workers' party. That means while its membership and voting base is anchored in the working class, with workers hoping for reforms that will create a better capitalist society, the party's project is to run Australian capitalism, and ultimately its key responsibility is to safeguard the interests of the Australian state and the Australian ruling class. So there's a contradiction. Yes, yet another one. I'd argue that the majority of the radical left in Australia see only one side of the contradiction. Rather than viewing things dialectically, they view the Labour Party through the prism of what is known as formal logic, looking at what is superficially correct. They quite rightly observe that the ALP is pro-capitalist. It's willing to use state power against workers and their unions, as it's done over the past 2 years or so against the construction union, the CFMEU. It's committed to Australian imperialism in the region and to its major imperialist ally, the US. One consequence of that is Labour's willingness to side with Israel despite the genocide in Gaza, even if it's cost them votes in some electorates. Now, most on the left look at this and are quite rightly disgusted, and they draw the conclusion that the ALP must be rejected root and branch. That means Labour members must be derided as complicit in the leadership's policies, and Labour voters must be berated to see the light and vote Green or Socialist. Now, this might make activists feel good about themselves, but it misses the point that there's another side to social democracy. The fact that millions of Labour voters and many of its members are looking for progressive change, and this brings them into conflict or contradiction with the leadership. So pro-Palestine ALP members and union officials have carried state conference resolutions against the genocide. Some 20 Labour MPs joined the giant march for Palestine over the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Labour members protested over the impending visit of the Israeli president and war criminal Isaac Herzog. Other Labour members have campaigned against the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine deal. Others again have protested against the war on the CFMEU. Now, for revolutionary socialists like Solidarity, this is important because we believe real change doesn't come through the passive process of parliamentary elections, but through mass struggle. And approached dialectically, Labour members and voters can be drawn into that struggle, boosting our chances of winning, for example, sanctions on Israel. In the formal logic of many on the radical left, Labour members and supporters are a problem. But every meaningful mass movement in this country's modern post-invasion history has come about because Labour members and voters have been mobilised. This was true of the movement against the Vietnam War, South African apartheid, the Iraq War of 2003, the Black Moratorium in support of Indigenous struggle, the mass political strikes against John Howard's work choices, the Black Lives Matter rallies, and much more. So for revolutionaries, playing on the contradiction with social democracy between a profoundly conservative leadership and a base that is open to a yearning for a different and better world, that can help build movements of resistance. But it doesn't stop there. As Labour's members and supporters move into conflict with their leadership, Hegel's negation, some will go further. Under the impact of experience and the arguments of revolutionary socialists alongside whom they are struggling, some, hopefully many, will break with Labour and Labourism and join the far left, and this is, in Hegel's terms, the negation of the negation. So to summarise, the ALP and its support base exists as simple unity, although pregnant with contradiction. Those contradictions come into play around concrete issues, bringing Social Democrats into conflict with their party leadership. This is the negation. And there is the potential for Labour members and supporters in struggle to build campaigns, to build movements of resistance, and in the process of doing so, to break to the far left. And this is the negation of the negation. I'll be brief, but a similar dialectical approach can help us get around a conundrum facing union activists, especially in a period like today when the level of industrial struggle is generally very low. The vast majority of union officials are, despite the political labels some put on themselves, very conservative. They are reluctant to build full-throated industrial action, especially in defiance of the anti-union laws, and they have been reluctant, if not hostile at times, to taking up the issue of Palestine. Look, it's not the case that most workers are champing at the bit to go on strike. Years of retreat have eaten away at levels of confidence. So workers tend to look to their officials for permission to act, the same officials who frequently are trying to avoid acting at all. So we could just throw our hands up in despair, but approached dialectically, it's possible to see a way forward. So union militants organised to the limit of what is currently possible. That in turn can put pressure on union officials to give their blessing to an action or a political position. Union militants use that increased political space to draw more members in behind them. and build confidence in their own ability. That pushes officials to take a stronger stance, to endorse a campaign, to initiate industrial action. And if done well, the virtuous spiral rises. The simple unity of the status quo, although containing contradiction with the officials, leading to a rank and file challenge to the officials' conservatism, in other words, the negation, leading to the negation of the negation, a stronger and more confident union mobilisation. Okay, that's a lot to take in. So here's an example. Teachers and school staff for Palestine in Victoria, faced with union officials who'd rather the issue of Palestine went away, neither despaired nor denounced. They organised resistance against repression in the strongest schools, took that as resolutions into union bodies, got reluctant support from officials, including official support for Palestine at the union's branch conference, the highest decision-making body of the union in the state, and turned that back into stronger rank-and-file organisation as the movement by the officials created a greater confidence by the rank and file to act. And they repeated that process around issues like the curriculum, with some success. All this culminated, at least to this point, in 250 teachers joining a contingent on the National Day of Action for Palestine last August. In turn, this activity laid the basis for establishing Fight the Crisis, a rank-and-file group of teachers and school staff who have led successful resistance to the officials' desire to settle an early deal in the current EB campaign in Victoria. So dialectics doesn't just apply to changes of epoch from feudalism to capitalism to socialism. The methodology can be used to drive forward the small chips of struggle. The trick, as Trotsky put it, is to exercise the dialectical training of our minds, just as a pianist does their finger exercises. It's worth the effort. After all, we're trying to change the world. I'll put some links in the show notes so you can read up in dialectics in more detail. Thanks for listening.